Working Cows Podcast, episode 180.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Conry, host of the Working Cows Podcast, powered by the Global Ag Network. And again, really excited to share with you the return of one of our favorite agricultural podcasts, Field Work, hosted by Mitchell Hora and Zach Johnson. They get together every week and talk about properly managing the resources entrusted to us. Every Wednesday, there's a new episode out talking about successfully managing the different resources that they have around them, focusing on Washington County, Iowa, where Mitchell farms and lives. There's a strong conservation culture there. So encourage you to check out the Field Work podcast at fieldworktalk.org and check out what they've got going on there. Very good resource there, all things soil health and those things. So go over and check that out. I'm very excited to be joined today by Wayne Knight. He is the Interim Executive Director of Holistic Management International. He's got a wealth of experience from 27 years of ranching using holistic management. He's had such influences in his life as Alan Savory and Stan Parsons and different things like that. His dad was an early adopter of these things, his father, Tom Knight. So very, very much really looking forward to this conversation with Wayne. We're going to talk to him about how he's been able to employ not just the land management things, but also the social management pieces of holistic management for better relationships with the community around him. So, Wayne, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast. Would you start off by telling me a little bit about your history as it relates to ranching?
I've grown up in South Africa on a big family ranch north of Pretoria, about 11,000 acres. That's been home ever since ever. I'm the youngest child, never thought I'd be back on the ranch, if you like. I thought my older brother would take over. Until quite late in my school career, I expected to go into veterinary, but had a deep affection and love with land, loved hunting, loved outdoors, high mountains, the higher the better. And growing up, loved bird watching, fishing, anything outdoors, and obviously 11,000 acres in Africa in a pretty wild environment is a young guy's dream come true. Didn't get into vet school and landed up, because of grades, studying economics, did a Bachelor of Science, and then joined my dad on the property after studying. And he was an early student of Stan Parsons and Alan Savory. They were partners back then and doing pioneering work. And I think out of the kind of consulting work that they did with my parents and their sort of, other farmers, ranchers like them, holistic management was born because Parsons and Savory realized early that first, Savory was looking at solving environmental problems and thought that he'd succeed with helping people in the environmental by helping them with the financial. Brought in Parsons, and they realized, well, they can do a lot of work with environmental and financial, and then things still weren't working out. And so really got into the human side. And to a large extent, I think we're still battling with the human side. Change is hard. There's great studies out there about how hard change is. But getting back to my story, Came over here in the 90s after graduating and worked for many of Stan Parsons' ranching for profit clients, Nebraska, Kansas, and then in California, and then came to a school in Albuquerque. Back then they were still doing this, or Parsons was doing that 7-day school, and really enjoyed it, got a lot out of it, was staying in Stan's house since he was a college friend of my dad's, and landed up working for him for a while. So actually had a really close and personal experience with ranching for profit and the Executive Link program. And yeah, after that headed back to the family property and made some big mistakes thinking that I knew it all, having been in the US and working for some people. And my dad always giving me enough rope to hang myself, if you like. You know, he really gave me freedom to make mistakes, and that was a critical part of learning. And then came back to holistic management school. I did with my fiance at the time, now wife, we did the introductions to holistic management. Came back to the family business and realized my parents weren't on the same page, although there was a lot of similarities in our, you know, the ecological view of things, the need for density, that kind of thing. Holistic management had evolved a long way from when they were involved with on a consulting sort of basis with Parsons and Savory. So I encouraged them to do the training, forced them, coerced them. And things went a lot better. My dad and I really worked well together. The concept of a holistic goal and just testing decisions allowed us to really work well together. That was a groundbreaking experience. South Africa had just gone through to become a democracy in 94. That's when the democracy, you know, that's when the elections happened. And when I got back to the property, it was 96. Interest rates were 27%. My dad had bought a farm to add capacity, but with interest rates like that, things were tough. And the holistic financial planning really made all the difference. We pulled through miraculously by really examining costs, and it was not traditional financial planning or economics that I'd learned at university. Is this kind of what you're looking for? I know I'm kind of rambling.
No, we'll come back to some of these high points and
then, you know, my dad he'd put in a lot of wagon wheels, the sort of traditional wagon wheel grazing systems, and that had created, you know, some structure and a lot of paddocks to allow us to move forward. But he had constraints on how big a herd should be and what density could look like. He didn't want to go over 150 cows in a herd. Being young, naive, and gung-ho, 150 was nothing, you know. So I mentioned making some mistakes, but after the mistakes, you get things sorted out, enough water, and I think some genetic changes, and I think we don't pay enough heed to genetics in the transitions we're encouraging people to do. It's sort of spoken about, but not a tool that we help people enough with. But getting the genetics right, my dad liked Beefmasters, and there's a great philosophy behind Beefmaster. Unfortunately, in reality, particularly in South Africa, a lot of the Beefmaster are really big. You know, the more BBU, if that means anything to you, the bigger framed was what my dad was able to get hold of. And downsizing animal frame was hugely important to making a success of things. Keeping that animal condition under density means a very different kind of animal. And that really struck me hard much later when I tried to expand into a joint venture where I was buying in animals for the first time. In other words, made all these progressions and then wanted to upsize and bought in animals for the first time and realized, oh my goodness, what we've got genetically is so valuable. So that's another side to things. So what I'm trying to get to here, I guess, in my preamble is that I've really benefited from many of the aspects of holistic management. That the social side, the intergenerational side, the financial planning saved our business, and we've really done a huge amount on that property. to improve carrying capacity, to improve water cycle. And that was brought home really well when I did a grade 10 science, we call it science, I guess it'd be biology, ecology project with my son. And we were measuring across fence, infiltration, interplant spacing, root depth, that kind of thing for his project. And the results were staggering. The worst, we were measuring water infiltration through a metal ring hit into the ground. And we were at least 23 times faster infiltration than our neighbors on water, just percolating into the ground on the same day. It was 23, I think, I forget the upper limit, but it was quite an eye-opener to realize what we've measurement-wise been able to do. And, you hear these stories often, but when you start measuring it yourself, you can see a difference. But when you measure it, then it suddenly has a different impact.
Yeah, that quantifiable. You can see the numbers and compare them, and it's kind of hard to argue with that raw data. Is interesting. Ariel Greenwood facilitated this connection between you and I appreciate that. She did mention that one potential nugget that we could pursue or mine was the way that holistic management impacted your relationships, I believe, with neighbors in South Africa. I think, role of holistic management in your neighborly relationships in South Africa. Does that mean anything to you?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, the long-term result of those interactions was not positive. We've moved to the States, positive or negative. So we weren't able to solve the problem, but let me give you some background, because I think it's the background that resonates. In around 2004, 2005, the South African government decided that land ownership would be, then it was a decision to purchase, whether you wanted to or not. The government would decide a price, so they would purchase your land, and it would be given to a community previous, the people who had, from the government's perspective, been dispossessed of land. So we have this colonial background, and our farm and another about 40,000 hectares, which is about 100,000 acres, in our immediate vicinity was earmarked for 3 communities of African people. And you can imagine that's quite a shock to the system. It hit my dad particularly hard. He'd worked really hard to purchase this land, hadn't really invested in a retirement. His investment was in the land. Didn't believe in insurance. His livestock were his insurance policy. If he needed cash, he'd sell livestock. That was his philosophy on life, and he kept it pretty simple like that. And when he was in his early mid-70s, to have this sort of thundercloud come along was a major issue. And at the time, we recognized that in the legal terms, we didn't have a case. We had a very strong case. So in terms of the way South African law was written at the time, and this is another one of those little bit of a mind benders, is we tend to think of law as static, and we tend to think of law as, it's always going to be like it is. So we did some research, and the lawyers that we asked to review the case said, no ways, this is not a valid case. You have a valid, you don't worry, we can fight this in court, as lawyers often do. And we thought about it and decided, no, we're not going to leave it there. We're going to be proactive, and we're going to engage the wider community so that we can actually proactively look at a solution here. Because in all communities, farming communities, there's an element or a grouping that will want to sell at a price. There's a grouping that will really want to keep ranching or farming, and there's another group that will kind of sit on the fence and see, well, if it's a good price, we'll get out or not. And then we had the claimant community, the people who claimed to have, and they were actually, it was very complex, as you can imagine. We're looking at thousands of people, not hundreds or tens of people, literally thousands of people out of clans claiming possession of land. And there were definitely claims in terms of someone had lived on the property and worked for my grandfather. My great-grandfather. So there was a connection to the land, but in terms of the law and the way the laws were written at the time, they weren't entitled to the whole property. They were entitled to compensation for the portion of land that they'd had access to. Because early on in the colonial setup, people could live on land, have cattle, plow, and then, they'd be on someone else's land, but with this right. So the government undertook that they would pay that person for the access to land that they no longer had. That was a sort of a government decision. I hope that's clear, that there's a difference between ownership and residential rights, if you like. That's sure. Essentially what it was. And now they were off the land, no longer had access. I'd say almost everyone had left by their own free will. So it was sort of a bit of a gray area. But okay, the government decided these kind of claims in our region were not valid. It was the whole property. So this whole area, all these farms, probably 30 individually land farms, were then put through and gazetted, put in a government newspaper. These farms are going to be bought. And so we brought in a colleague of mine, certified educator, to come and use holistic management to engage with the communities. So we realized we needed to get the local farmers, the people, the landowners, together and reach a consensus on what our approach would be. Because it's no use me talking on behalf of a group and I have a different story. Then we went to the claimants and spoke with the elders. So we had 30 or 40 people in a meeting and just trying to get consensus among themselves. What is their view of what, using this idea that people have very similar wants and desires, and it's trying to reach consensus on what those are rather than fighting the problem. Let's see what we all want really at the base, the values-wise, in terms of expectations that are grounded. So we did this with these different groups, and it was remarkable. We had really good consensus on what each group wanted within each constituency. And then later on, we brought the groups together to have dialogue based on, well, we as a group want this, and you as a group want that. And is this reasonable? And hear each other out. And then, okay, so what can we put to government as a solution? And we went a long way down the path. The devil was in the government that actually didn't want a solution. So we tried to get the government officials. They were called the, what was it called? RLC, Regional Land Claims Commission. They were the people in charge of overseeing, making decisions for communities, what land was going to be bought, what land was going to be left in the original owner's hands, and so on. And they didn't want to play ball. I think they were feeling threatened. So the whole thing didn't die. It just kind of fizzled out because we couldn't, although we had a good agreement between the landowners and the claimants, we didn't get any feedback or any positive traction from government. But what was the significant part of the story is how through using holistic management and this goal of, well, what do we want right now and what has to be in place in the future, for you to be happy, for us to be happy, we came a long way to recognizing what a solution could look like. And it's sad that it didn't follow through and reach a resolution, but it was an eye-opening experience to have gone through that. Unfortunately, now we're sitting with a situation where the government is threatening to change the law and actually take land. So literally expropriate. And so there are a lot of people who are on the edge of maybe losing their property, like Zimbabwe, or not. And the government in South Africa seems pretty hell-bent on taking land. They call it expropriation without compensation. That's kind of theft, if you put it in my terms, but a nice word for theft. But so that leaves extreme uncertainty. And I mean, our holistic goal came significantly into this. I've wanted to be on that ranch. I've wanted to live there and be there as my primary goal. A lot of my goal was centered on that piece of land, and my persona, my individuality is tied in a kind of a way to that piece of land. And yet the way we were living no longer matched the goal. And although that was quite a mind-bending experience to actually extricate ourselves from the property, the theft, the uncertainties. We lost a lot of animals. We had some neighbors murdered. And it was just a case of, well, this is what we want in our lives. This is what we've got that we don't have any control over. So instead of testing towards the goal, we tested the goal and how our lives and reality fitted with the goal. And that helped us decide to eject, to come over here. I mean, I'm fortunate that I'm connected, and I've done some, I think, pretty amazing things with land, and I've got a long and very affectionate relationship with holistic management, and that means I have an opportunity here in the US. So, yeah, that's the long story.
Yeah, so it's theft with enough syllables to introduce ambiguity. Expropriation without compensation. That's theft with enough syllables to introduce ambiguity.
Yeah.
Oh man.
And it's tough to make that call. But in reality, if you wait too long, well, my logic is if we waited to see where it turned out, there is a point where you actually are not able to move. Right. I think a lot of Zimbabwean farmers landed up in that situation. Those that sold, got something for their land and moved, had an opportunity to start again. Those that didn't and waited to see what would happen are stuck. Their assets are worthless. Their options are gone. And we decided we weren't going to let that happen. We weren't going to be victims, and that is a very clear decision. That's a very clear line of,
You mentioned the holistic goal setting process, I think is what you were talking about, that you went through with the elders and you went through with the ranchers and you brought the two groups together. Was there some point at which the size of that group grew to the point that it was no longer effective, or were you able to get fairly large groups together and still have effective meetings using these holistic goal-setting tools?
I would say early on, we were probably 40 participants. So landowners, so farmers, farming families, usually husband and wife, would be at the meetings, and then the elders of the tribal groups would be at the meetings. But with time and government really just not showing up for meetings, we'd have meetings and then people would take the time, arrive, and the government officials just wouldn't pitch up. And we'd wait and then disband and set another date. And that attrition meant that we wore down and landed up with fewer and fewer people participating because of the waste of time, the waste of resource, and this breakdown in trust. You need to have committed people to a process. And it wasn't that the stakeholders weren't committed. At least initially, it was that the process was flawed because not all the players were playing.
You mentioned early on that financial planning saved the ranch, and you mentioned an interest rate in excess of 20% at that time. Could you talk about the process, the financial planning process that you were going through, and what you believe was the mechanism within that process that helped to mitigate the difficulty presented by a 20+% interest rate?
Yeah, for a while it was over 27%, and that's obviously crippling when you've got relatively high debt having purchased land. I think the biggest contributor there was this idea of, well, we're not going to sell the ranch. We've decided we want to stay here, and now what are we going to do? The whole market was depressed at the time, so that made selling cattle to make the payments really not an option. And it was the holistic financial planning process of, well, here are our expenses. Now, what are we cutting? Well, we can't cut enough. We're already at bare bones. Yes, that's what we've been spending. What can we really just not do with? I mean, Gabe Brown tells this very similar story of, so many seasons and hail, and we didn't have the hailstorms, but we had the economy to deal with and low prices. So, that discrepancy. And it's really a question of, we have so many habitual expenses. We have expenses, and our whole planning process. I've actually been in the last few days looking at university generated spreadsheets on, what are your costs? And the first line item is feed. What are your feed input costs? What are you buying? What hay are you feeding? And that's how we think. Well, that's what we put into the feed. Instead of saying, well, here's our income and here are our requirements. What are we going to do? What can we do without to make sure that what we're getting in matches? We've got this, in holistic management, that's how we do it. We got the income. Now we've got to fit our expenses into the planned profit or the amount of money that we have. The mental approach of what are we going to spend this income on, instead of, well, last year we spent this, we're going to up it by 5% and go with it. It's really digging in. It's unpacking expense item by expense item. And it was traumatic. I'm not saying it wasn't difficult. I remember my dad, he was a big white beard and white curly hair, sitting at the table, shaking his head and saying, Wayne, we've already cut. We can't cut anymore. It was a case of, well, we have to cut. We've made up our minds that we're staying, but we've got to just cut back. It means cutting staff. It means cutting fuel. For example, we used to buy how many gallons? I think it's 2,000 liters. So, a big diesel container. And that was the norm. We'd done that ever since ever. And suddenly it was a case of, well, no, we're going to be buying 5 gallons of diesel at a time. And that's all we're going to use, and that's how we're going to make sure, put the cans on the back of the pickup, and that's what we've got. That's how we're going to measure what we're using. It's not free diesel or, just go and fill up and write it on the chart anymore. Simple little things that were fundamental, in really, really cutting. I used to know or remember the figures of how much we cut. It seemed impossible at the time, but it was really analyzing costs and making sure that we weren't spending money on things we didn't need to spend money. And I think in holistic management, the cost-cutting side of things for a lot of people is where we should be starting. We want to start on the ecological side. We want to make the environment better. But in terms of changing habits and change, and that's one of the big things, isn't it? In this game, our biggest challenge as educators and bringing people in is, how do we help them make changes? And it's holistic. Thinking holistically is of prime importance. So how do you help someone really dig into how they think about things? And for me, the financial planning is high reward area. It's immediate change. It's immediate results. And what are those habitual expenses that you actually can do without?
Yeah. Sometimes the easiest way to make $1 is not to spend one.
Yeah.
You mentioned also kind of in your introduction to your own background, that getting the genetics right was really important. And I think what you were saying was maybe that the beef masters had kind of fallen prey to that same space race that the Angus associations went through, where they chased that larger and larger carcass and animal and more higher and higher weaning weights. Is that somewhat
Absolutely
related?
Yes, very much large frame. I really enjoy Johann Zietsman's. I don't know if you're familiar with Johann. Mm-hmm. He did a couple of courses, and we bought some genetics from him really early on, in probably the late 90s. And there was a lot of talk in our communities, in our groups, holistic management groups, about genetics. But genetics is such a personal thing. Most people love their genetic, whether it's for the right reasons or the wrong reasons. They're their reasons, and therefore they're valid, right? There's no question, knowing what I know now, that the kind of animals we choose should really be matching the cost-saving mindset that I've been talking to. It's sensible. And cost of gain is everything, right? What is your cost of gain on your animals, and the lower that is, the better you're going to do in the tough times, and the more profit you're going to make in the better times. I think we all deal, whether it's the US or Canada or wherever, South Africa, we all deal with these massive fluctuations in commodities. And various times I've tried backgrounding, and you buy what looked like inexpensive calves, and then you bring in feed to gain weight, and you try these different business models, and for a couple of years this model works really, really well, until the price of the calves goes really high and the price of the feed goes really high, and you land up making big losses. It's not safe. It's gambling. What is the safe way to do this, and what is the way to generate reliable, low-risk solar dollars, how to harvest that? And that's looking at the genetics really hard, and not necessarily buying in the best genetics, but getting rid of the worst genetics, and not selling because they not the best genetics, just sell them for whatever price. It's working out where you can get value for those animals. You have these sort of people saying, well, they're the grasshoppers, just get rid of them. They cost you more than they're worth. Well, you can do that. It is an option, but how can you add value? Because they're a poor cow doesn't mean you can't sell them with a calf and get a lot more money than a thin, empty cow. Right. If you've got enough grazing, you've got enough food out there, then turning what looks like a poor cow into a valuable cow for someone else isn't a bad idea. It's being creative about and using the resource that you have to balance. Where can you do this? How can you make the money out of the animal, rather than just, well, she's a poor animal, gone. When there's a drought, you've got too little food. You got to, you're expecting to run out of feed. It depends on your weak link, of course. If you can get rid of her and make money out of her, by all means, do that.
So, would you say that what's worth tracking in a herd is efficiency? Some of the, that ability to convert forage to pounds of beef. Is that something that's worth tracking, or is there, how do you go about kind of choosing those that are going to be the first to go when the drought does come?
So when to stand back from the actual genetics, So are you asking that in relation to genetics or in relation to drought planning?
Genetics.
I didn't have a breeding season. So a lot of people would say that's crazy. I think in a US context, it probably would be crazy because of your winters and because of the tough conditions when it gets cold, particularly the further north you go. So we had a pretty soft environment. But with my management and especially early on getting the animal condition wrong, and this whole idea of you need to sell the animals that are poor because they've missed a calf is absolutely fine. If you land up selling cows because your management is poor, that's a really dumb decision. So in terms of what do people need to, what did I select for? I think that's the better way to answer the question. Definitely there's a phenotype that looks off. Anything masculine, anything really taller, bigger is most of the time going to be your poorer animal. That was particularly true when I came into the farming business. So I'm going to tell a story here. We used to keep records of all sorts of things on spreadsheets, lots of data capture, out of my ears data capture. But what I pretty early found out is that if I walked into the herd and we were going to take out, because we decided we were going to destock, we're going to take out all the animals that had a sub 500 day into calving period. Run the spreadsheet. Now you're going through those numbers. And we had tags at the time and brands, the number. And the brands you'd think would be pretty easy. But what we learned pretty quickly is, well, let's just take out all the high backs. Any cow with a high back, she's probably in this group. There are probably 3 or 4% that aren't tall backs. The rest are the bigger animals. So that's a pretty steep learning curve. You're immediate. If she's taller than the average, she's probably missed a few times. So in terms of marginal reaction, your time spent on getting results, if you're choosing your bigger animals, just the bigger frame score, those correlate extremely highly to poor reproductive efficiency. They cull themselves. And so looking for the smaller animals, looking for deep body, looking for a nice big rumen, you can see these animals. Boonsma did it, Gerald Fries talked about it, Johan Zietzman, they're all talking the same language, and there's a damn good reason for that. And you can see it. And sometimes most of the time I kept all my heifers, except the really bottom of the barrel, and bred them. If it was a drought situation, initially I sold too many heifers, and that hurt me. When I arrived back on the ranch and my dad had bought the property and the very high interest rates, I sold almost all our heifers. And I went through the herd and I selected, I think, 15 out of 250 heifers to sell, thinking they were the best. And when we bred them, they were absolutely the worst. What I thought were the best were the worst. So that was a lesson early on in, you think you know what you're looking for, but you don't. So after that, unless they were really runtish looking or really butch looking, I didn't sell them, simply because you can see that those are going to be, the off types. Kept as many heifers as I could, and rather selected my older cows or cows that had slipped. So cows that I would be marginal on. We had a lot of predation and we had a lot of tick-borne diseases. So animals that lost a calf, I didn't always cull. We lost 68 calves one year to leopards. So that's a lot of cows to cull because of a big cat that we tried guardian dogs and they got eaten. So we'd clip tags to show potential cull. And 2 clips would be a definite cull. And that enables you to have an idea of the marginal ones, should they go, must they go? But to keep it simple and not to be overly complicated or overly harsh on culling because she's not got a 380-day intercalving period. I gave up on trying to do that level of data capture. It was simply not worth the time, I thought.
Yeah. And I think that kind of what you're talking about as far as masculinity, we've talked to Steve Campbell, who was a disciple of Gerald Fry. I've spent quite a bit of time in the Johann Zeitzman's texting group, kind of trying to absorb some of what he is sharing, and so I kind of understand that. But that's kind of that cow that's getting bigger, going as she goes back. She's looks like she's walking downhill on level ground. Some of those things we talked about with Steve Campbell on the episode that I did with him. So I think it's an interesting thing that you can kind of speed up that selection process by looking for some of those that are obviously maybe the opposite of that or on the other side of that or that body type.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a balance there too, that you don't go too far on the dairy cow, the long-necked cow that gives too much to her calf, gets really, really skin and bones. She'll wean a beautiful animal, but will she be able to do it next year? Being careful not to go too far that way as well. There's balance. Much more difficult to find that animal, but you can see her if you're learning and looking for what those dairy kind of animals that are too soft on their offspring, give too much to their offspring, I should say. It is the other, the extreme, so you definitely want it in the middle of the bunch.
Sure. And so I don't generally edit for content, but if you want to refuse to answer this question, you are welcome to. And I'm trying not to be I don't in any way want to be a political show either. But do you see any things that we should be warned of in the United States as far as a trajectory that might be similar to what happened in South Africa, where land is expropriated, or any of those things? Are there any things that you see in the headlines that make you say, that might be a little worrisome or similar to what we went through in South Africa?
I think the political situation is very, very different. Okay. I think in South Africa there's a populist group that don't really understand economics. And I mean, I'm not trying, I guess that immediately sounds like, this guy thinks he's ahead of the curve and privileged and educated. I really don't think that a big chunk of South Africa's electorate understand the implications of expropriating land. And I don't think the US is anywhere close to that kind of thinking. It's not on an American's radar, having been in Tanzania and Malawi and places like that, where there isn't a legal system and where a piece of paper that's a title deed is pretty meaningless because there's no court to uphold it. When you're exposed to that, then land ownership becomes much more shifting. I'd say America's being opinionated here, maybe. America's big problem with politics is that social media has divided the two ways of thinking, and everyone's listening to the same news. And then, if you're in this camp, you listen to that news because that's what you like and that's what you get in this camp, and no one's hearing the other opinion. And that's about choices of what's been listened to more than understanding the fundamentals. It's a very different scenario, I think.
Yeah, appreciate that. Brian Alexander recently launched the Ranching Reboot podcast, and he asked me to come on and be one of his first guests. And he asked me, what do we do to make the world a better place at the end? And I said, well, Brian, I'm a Jesus guy. So when it comes, to questions like that, I tend to default back to what he said. And he said, the two greatest commandments are love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And I said, well, let's focus on that second commandment. Too often we don't know any of our neighbors or any of our quote unquote opponents, outside of that political rally scenario. When I'm holding up a sign that says you're dumb and you're holding up a sign that says I'm dumb, we never get to know anybody outside of those contexts, and we have everybody pigeonholed into their left or their right before we ever get a connection beyond that with them. And I think that's facilitating as much of the, as you said, as much of the political conflict in our country as anything.
And I think a big part of that's journalism. That the journalistic quality of the journalism is geared to getting views or reads rather than to portraying a balanced perspective. If you like Trump and everything that Biden does is evil, and that's what you hear morning, noon, and night, and vice versa, everything Trump does is evil. Of course, not everything either of them does is evil. They're all motivated for a reason, and they're not totally bad or totally good. There's good and bad. And if you're a journalist, journalism by nature is give a balanced view. It used to be. And you can pick up an article and read it, and in the first paragraph, you know where it's going. That's not journalism. That's I don't know what you'd call it, but it's storytelling, or it's not helpful, and that's because people demand that kind of reporting rather than, well, give me a balanced view, and that's
it goes
ourselves
back to
blame.
It goes back to that conversation about economics, supply and demand. The demand says they want journalism that tells them that their opinions are right, rather than tells them the truth. And so that's kind of that's what ends up getting produced, because that's what is being demanded. So I guess where I'd like to go from here in the time that we have left is, do you see, or what do you see as the challenges, or are the challenges facing the U.S. As far from an agricultural perspective, different from the challenges and the solutions that you have experienced thus far in your career as it relates to South African agriculture?
Look, I think there are a lot of parallels. In Africa, South Africa is pretty marginal in terms of agricultural production. I'm in Texas, and looking West Texas, a lot of the ranching country, or farming country, I beg your pardon, a lot of the farming country there is very similar to the area that I've been grown up in. Water aquifers under stress, huge investment in above ground infrastructure, irrigation infrastructure, lots of risk in, on the panhandle, it's more cotton and grains, but where I'm from, a lot of citrus and grapes, and huge investments, and more wells being sunk, less and less reliable water, people buying land competitively to prevent someone else from getting access to the underground water. So a lot of parallels there. The whole commodity market, the whole agricultural, big ag influence on food and nutrient density and land degradation. I think we're all joining the dots there very well. The huge challenge is how to help people change. I think I came in talking about the challenges of change and the risks of change. And to tell a story there, as a young holistic management practitioner in South Africa, very keen on what we were doing, passionate about it, like I still am. We used to have a lot of open days and farmers' days, and people coming onto our property and show and tell and speak and have a lecture, and then go and look at what's happening. And lots of neighbors coming along and having a look at this and saying, okay, Gwen, this is really good. It's inspiring what you're doing. It's not going to work with me. And I explained to my mom, and what's going on? Why don't more people try this? Why don't more people do this? And she looked at me and said, because they don't have the luxury to fail. In other words, we had enough financial backing that it wasn't even a thought in my head. I mean, we had tough times and things, but we had enough backing. Our debt wasn't outrageous. It's really hard for people to change. From a risk point of view, from a habit point of view, from a human relationship point of view, I think the biggest challenge that we face in most of the agricultural spheres that I've been in, whether it was ranching for profit or what we're trying to do at HMI now with groups of ranchers, there's a huge challenge on making changes that are not high risk to relationships, high risk financially, and high risk to market. And that's the challenge. I mean, it sounds so simple, but it's really difficult to help people through those changes and together. I remember Dick Richardson was the educator who was really my mentor in South Africa into getting into holistic management, and he used to remind the group, the education group that we were in. It took the British Navy 300 years to adopt limes onto their ships to prevent scurvy after the merchant navy had been doing it 300 years for the generals to say, well, our soldier sailors need limes. That's a very simple thing to change. And we're asking people to change the way they do finances. We're asking them to change the way they manage their livestock. We're asking them to change the way that their internal decision making happens, particularly in paternal environments where dad or pop or someone has been the decision maker. It's not part of another grouping in the household. Now you're asking everyone to sit around the table and make decisions, or dad's got to include son in the decision making, or whatever the dynamic. We've got to change that, and that is really hard. People don't like that change, and that is unfortunately our challenge. Is we can educate and we can inspire with great stories and great examples, but our biggest challenge is helping a large number of people to make habit changes to allow them to do what's needed in the agricultural sphere. And it's held back by markets, it's held back by banking regulations, it's held back by insurance, especially in the farming sphere. It's a very, very difficult structurally place to make safe changes.
So we had an email exchange prior to this, and I want to read a sentence from one of the paragraphs that you sent me, and it kind of goes to this point and gets some a little bit more flesh on some of these ideas. It says, remember, people resist change, even simple changes. In adopting regenerative ag, we are asking people to make significant changes in multiple facets of life. We need, quote unquote, doing on a small enough scale to not disrupt the business's complex components, but also large enough changes that old habits are challenged, disrupted, and recreated on multiple levels of life. We need
That's
doing.
A mouthful. Wow.
It was you. So what I'm trying to wrap my head around is that referring to within each individual business. So we are going to experiment at an enterprise level with small change in one area, and if it's successful, we'll broaden it out? Or is that within an individual operation, we need those places to be kind of labs of experimentation, and then hopefully that will grow out and influence the rest of agriculture as a whole? Or is it something other than those two entirely?
That's pretty much what I'm thinking of we're thinking of is making incremental changes. When we talk about, holistic planned grazing is such a wonderful thing. It is. But going from, say, on the one extreme, set stocking, to multiple paddocks and tightly spaced, I've been through those changes. Well, we didn't have set stocking, but we went from 150 cows in a herd on maybe 6 herds across the property to one herd with 600 cows and 500 calves and a whole bunch of bulls and heifers thrown in to make a really big herd, and you land up with too little water and the animals don't know what the hell's going on. The competitiveness of that herd is a huge issue. The staff think you've lost your mind. The pipe capacity is not big enough. The water holding capacity in the trough's too much, but the supply to the trough's too small. Classic examples that you hear about when you do a holistic management training. I've been there. I've made those mistakes. Thin cows, too few bulls, not enough food in their stomachs, not moving nearly quickly enough, just a mess. So what is the right change around? What is the way to encourage people to make a change? And if we can help people to make small changes that don't cost them the business so that they can learn this, we know that the higher the density of the animals, the better the outcome. But what's the right density and what's too much density for a West Texas rancher? You hear stories of people who've tried density and they've tried it 3 years ago and it's still bare. Well, there's lots of variables at play, but what are you comfortable with and how do you learn that level of comfort within your environment, within your space? It's not me from South Africa coming in and saying, well, your density should be so many £1,000 per acre. It's what worked in your environment. How are you going to test that? What's the right recovery time? How long should your animals be out for your West Texas, East Texas, South Dakota, Maine, wherever you are? What is the right time? Who knows that? Which expert knows that? No one does. So what can we do to help you figure that out? What experiment can you do on your property that's going to make a huge difference to your understanding of what density's capacity is and what recovery time is needed? That can be low risk. It could be very, very simple. Now, you've got an idea that you should be looking at a 300-day recovery period, and you should be looking at a cow for every 6 yards, because pounds per acre is really difficult to get your head around. So, let's make it one cow for 3 square yards. That's really dense. Mm-hmm. Whatever it's going to be and whatever you've experimented, you at least know something more now than you did before. And if you're going to cover crops and you've been making your money out of cotton and you owe some money to the government or to the bank and the government insurance, and there's this interrelation, how do you make a small change without costing you your business? You try something small. You try a cover crop. You try a mix. You put some, and you see what happens. And it sounds slow and we want quick fixes. But it's far cheaper to make those kinds of transitions little bit by little bit, to put your animals into ultra high density for 5 or 6 days, see what it looks like, see what the animals do, how do they behave, is the fencing going to hold up? And if it all blows apart, well, okay, we're back to the way we were. Making those small incremental changes changes your view of what's possible. It helps you understand what some of the limits are, what some of the implications are. In a number of holistic management people who I've been interviewing and talking to figure out what are we doing wrong, or how can we make this easier for more people? I mean, that's the ultimate goal. How do we help people transition to regenerative practices? I mean, if we could figure that out, it would be wonderful. And so many are saying, well, we've got to make it simpler and we've got to make it easier to adapt. Isn't this a possibility of figuring out we've got to keep the density high. Going from no density to low densities, we're not just kidding around. Where's the threshold? We have to get to some level of density. The old way is, gradually build it up, go from 16 paddocks to 17 to 18 to 19. Well, we can still address a weak link by having a passage in our best area of our property and trying out a week long of ultra high density grazing. And if it blows out halfway through, releasing, than going to try and do this on the whole property. The animals need to change, the people need to change, and the environment needs to change. Every time I up my density and up my changed my recovery periods, the dynamic of the whole property or the whole area changes. You get this massive influx, and then you get a new stability, and then you get a massive change on biodiversity, and then you get a new stability. We've got to figure these things out. We've got to be recording. We've got to be watching, photographing, because we don't remember. There's so much at play. What's your most important experiment? What makes sense for you to try out? We can help people to figure what experiments they need to be doing without it costing them business, without them costing them so much that they can't continue. And by building confidence in small experiments, you kind of, I can't go back. Well, I'm hoping that's a hypothesis, not a definite. But if you can see what one cow per 3 square yards does and what happens to that piece of land 6 months and a year afterwards, wow, you've learned something profound. What does it cost you? Some hours to put up a fence, some time to get the animals in there, some time to record, but it's not costing you water infrastructure. It's not costing you massive fencing. It's not costing you relationships. Because I think a lot of the time, speaking from my own experience, early on, my dad and me wrestling with each other about, how are we going to do this? When you start out holistic management, you haven't figured out this complexity. You haven't really figured out the goal. You haven't figured out many aspects of what makes this, what I think is a profound whole, but you're still figuring it out. And you're trying to do all this stuff and you're having arguments about how to do it. If we could just slow this down, we'd probably make more progress.
Well, very good. Wayne, I really appreciate your time today. Is there anything else that you would like to let people know about? Anything coming up with HMI or anything like that you would like to be included in the show notes page for today, workingcows.net/180?
I'm reticent to say what I'm wanting to say because I think we're really working hard on creating some breakthrough in the grazing, but I haven't got it all figured out quite yet. I think there's going to be some really exciting stuff coming from HMI in terms of not necessarily chucking out the old way of doing a grazing plan, because I think it has lots of value. But I think what we're really wanting to do is have more monitoring points and key monitoring points. So more monitoring points on different levels of the business. I'm really keen on helping people understand animal performance, and I think this is a theme that other organizations are doing as well. What are the key components that we need to be looking at in terms of how to keep our animals productive, how to get animals moving for production for now rather than the time orientation. We've been moving animals very much per the grazing plan on time, and people don't like to monitor, particularly doing grazing assessments and biological monitoring. So what can we do to simplify what is going to show you whether you're improving your your soil.
Very good. And so holisticmanagement.org would be the place to send people if they want to keep an eye out for some of those changes coming and find a program to attend as far as training is concerned.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Thank you.
Right. Yeah.
Thanks, Clay.
Yep. Thank you, Wayne, for the opportunity. Appreciate your time today.
Super.
Good stuff there. Really appreciate Wayne and his time. Again, head over to the show notes page for today, workingcows.net/180 for links to fieldworktalk.org, the Fieldwork Podcast, Mitchell Hora and Zach Johnson. New episodes every Wednesday there. Also, we'll see you next week again with another episode of the Working Cows Podcast. Going to talk about winter supplementation strategies with Aaron Berger of Nebraska Extension and the Beef Watch podcast. So look forward to that next week on the Working Cows Podcast.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.